Hey listeners, this is Evan here in post-production. Just wanted to let you know that we had some technical issues in this episode, so you're going to hear people's sound qualities kind of go in and out, especially up top. But it all evens out eventually, and if you have a problem with it, you can Venmo me $5. Thanks.
You're listening to Contesting Wrestling, a podcast where I'm on a journey to try and understand why people enjoy wrestling, why people do this with their time. I, like statistically most humans, look at professional wrestling and say, what is this? Who put this on? Get out of my house. Our friendship is over. I don't you had sex with my wife. This is getting specific. The point is, I don't care for wrestling traditionally, but I also deeply love and respect my co-hosts, and we're on a journey to try to learn some new things, and then occasionally they're going to bring in their friends to outnumber me, but also to give me a different perspective on why people enjoy wrestling and what draws people to this art form. Also, my name is Evan Burt. Just putting that out there so everybody listening can feel like they can identify with me as a person with a name. Doc, kicking this to you.
I guarantee you Evan is a real person with a real name. I'm a real person with a real name. And as far as you're concerned, that name is Doc Diamondfire. And I've been involved in the professional wrestling business for about 11 years. I've done a wide variety of things, wrestling, commentary, ring announcing. I've been at a ton of shows. I'm very happy to be doing this podcast. And I will throw it to you, Professor. Let's hear it.
Yes, Dr. Ben Abelson is the conventional designator designating the constantly changing stream of thoughts and particles that make up what is conventionally known as Dr. Ben Abelson. I'm a professor of philosophy at Mercy College and a fan of professional wrestling. And yeah, I'm very excited today on the podcast to have our dear friend of now 15 years. I think we've known this individual, David Kim.
Hey, Dave.
What's up, Dave? Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, what's going on, guys? Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being on the podcast. Today, we wanted to get into some classic puroresu. And while Doc and I know a bit about the Japanese form of professional wrestling, Dave, you are much more an expert in this particular area of wrestling. So we wanted to have you on to share your expertise with the listeners.
Well, thank you. Been a fan of Japanese professional wrestling for well over 10 years now. Thanks to watching Ring of Honor, we've been turned on to all the Japanese talent. Then it turned into watching All Japan Pro Wrestling. And so
you really kind of got into it the same way that we did through Ring of Honor. And we met you going to Ring of Honor shows.
Yeah, we were all standing on line together because for some reason, all of us had to get to these shows hours and hours early.
Well, it was because of the whole GA
situation. We may have done it anyway, just for the community aspect. And one day, our party and Dave started talking, and then we ended up talking for hours. And now we're talking on this podcast, so that's cool. It's rare you find people as like gigantic wrestling fans, even at wrestling shows, that are as big, if not bigger, wrestling fans than you are. And when you do, you latch onto them a bit.
And that you would want to have in your apartment or like talk to for more than 5 minutes.
Right. If I talk to Dave about something that's not wrestling, Dave's cool. That helps.
So, Dave, you took like a deep dive into the AJPW stuff after seeing these guys on Ring of Honor. Were you at Joe versus Kobashi? I don't think we knew you quite then.
No, we didn't meet at that time. And I was still not living in New York at that time. So unfortunately, I didn't have the pleasure of seeing Kobashi live.
That is a drag.
Yes, indeed. And that was one of the best matches I've seen ever in ROH.
Before we get into the specific matches for today, I want to ask a couple like general questions that I ask of anybody who comes on here. Dave, can you put into words what it is that you love about wrestling and what draws you to it?
Oh, so many things. There's characters, in-ring storytelling, little soap opera kind of vibe that people would say it's soap opera for guys. And then like the incredible athleticism. There's so many different things. Just you throw them into one and there's your answer.
Are you a sports fan outside of wrestling?
Baseball only, really. Yeah.
When you watch wrestling, is it more on the sports side of things? Is it more on the entertainment side of things for you? Or is it really like kind of both?
I'd say it's a little bit of both.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit on the sports athletic side and a little bit on the entertainment side.
Sure.
I like a mix.
It seems to me that your particular tastes tend to veer more towards the sports, hard-hitting kind of athletic kind of wrestling like that we see in
Right.
Would that be
I'd say
accurate?
that'd be accurate, yes. With the twist of the entertainment, I mean, I like my share of gimmicks too.
Well, you can't. Most wrestling fans, even the most serious wrestling fans, you're not made of stone. A well done wacky gimmick is very different than a poorly done wacky gimmick. And a well done that fits within the world and makes sense with everything else, that's great no matter who you are, I think.
True.
How old were you when you got into wrestling, and what are like some of your early memories around it?
Okay, so I started watching the WWF when I was 13, so this would be around 93. So my first favorites were the 1, 2, 3 Kid, Bret Hart, and The Undertaker. I used to draw pictures of The Undertaker like over and over and over.
He was so cool.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So when you first started watching Ring of Honor, what was it that really stood out for Ring of Honor to you as particularly interesting?
In-ring action, definitely. I remember going into an FYE. Oh my gosh, how long ago did those exist?
Oh boy. A store where you buy physical media.
I was more of a Sam Goody man myself.
I was a Coconuts man.
I used to go to the Virgin Megastore. I'm sure I bought
Couple
something
times,
from there once or twice.
Oh yeah, I might have bought something
Yeah.
from Tower Records, but
But I hung out in the Virgin Megastore.
I certainly ended up with a lot of their stock somehow.
I used to go to the Ticketmaster location at my local Tower Records to wait online to buy tickets to see bands.
So what did you find at FYE?
Bands, hold on. Bands were when a bunch of people picked up physical instruments and played them at the same time. They'd do it on stage and people would just stand there and watch, like with their eyes, not like through a screen or anything. Man, we're getting old.
But I found a copy of The Era of Honor Begins
Oh, yeah.
in FYE, and that main event just blew me away.
Yeah,
So-
we've watched that for the podcast.
Yeah, we actually have. It's it holds up. There are certain things about it that I'm sure the guys in it would have wanted to tighten up a little if they were to watch it now. But it holds up. It's a revelation, especially when you put it in historical context.
Oh, no.
So we asked you to pick a good match and a bad match for us to watch to get a feel for 90s Puroresu. And so the good match you picked is a tag team match between Kenta Kobashi and Mitsuharu Misawa.
Right?
And what was their tag team? What were they called?
They didn't have a particular name. I know their opponents, Toshiaki Kawada and Akira Taue, were
The Holy Demon Army, right?
Holy
Wait,
One.
you were telling me Misawa
Yes.
and Kobashi were like over generation or something like that?
Yes, that's where they started along with Kawada as they started rivalry with the older guys, which was led by Jumbo Tsuruta, and Akira Taue was a part of that group. That group had disbanded after Jumbo contracted hepatitis B.
Oh,
And
no.
so he was no longer able to wrestle on a main event level. So after that, it was not long after that that Kawada left Misawa's group and joined forces with Akira Taue, thus forming the Holy Demon Army.
And that
So-
was because Misawa and Kawada were a tag team before, right?
Right.
And how did they fall out?
They wound up, I know they lost the tag team titles early in 93, and then for whatever reason, their relationship was strange. All I remember hearing was they were just told for Kawada to break out, form alliance with Akira Taue. That's just the way I remember it.
It feels to me a bit like, kind of like a Bret Hart Owen Hart relationship there, where like they're not brothers, but like Misawa got more of the fanfare, more of the attention. He won the world title first, and that like Kawada was kind of jealous of Misawa's success. Does that make sense?
That makes sense, yeah. And then they were still allies when Kawada first challenged Misawa for the Triple Crown title. So it was then, after that, it was months after that Kawada left the group. And then they were all out adversaries.
I have a question
from
about
that.
the Triple Crown title.
Right.
What is that? What are the three crowns?
The three crowns put into one, yes. So that was, I believe, the PWF title. I think there was a NWA International title, I believe it was, and one other that I can't quite remember. But yeah, they wound up unifying those titles back in '89.
And that is still the top title, singles title in All Japan, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, All Japan has had it's had a few lean years lately for a variety of reasons, not the least of which being the gigantic juggernaut that has been New Japan and its expansion, and other kinds of Japanese wrestling breaking through, and All Japan having a bit more of a traditional style, but not really having its own voice lately. I don't know. It's not going anywhere. It may pick back up
I went
again.
to an All Japan show in Osaka in January of 2019, and it really felt
cool.
like an indie show, like a very well-produced indie show, but it was a tiny place. The wrestlers were all there at the merchandise booths, and it felt like they were trying to give off more of a kind of traditional, like family-oriented vibe.
That makes sense.
I have a question about kayfabe in Japan at the time, and I guess like sort of like the relation or like how it works in comparison to American kayfabe. Because one thing that struck me, and tell me if I'm just way off base here, but something that struck me watching the match, this main match, is that so if I was watching American wrestling, even if I was like a casual watcher who was just flipping by it or something, like you have to be pretty dumb to think it's like a real contest. But this kind of struck me. I mean, obviously, you know, if you pay a little attention, it's very clear still that they are, you know, doing pro wrestling, which involves helping each other do the throws and stuff like that. And they're, you know, not quote unquote really fighting. But it struck me that like a casual watcher, I might think that it's like a real it has much more of an appearance of a real contest.
Yeah, I'd say that's very true. It's sold a lot more real. And even if the people in the stands know what wrestling is, it's a lot more accepted to just go with it as though it was a real sport. You know, famously, the media would report on it like it was a real sport, even if everybody knew what was going on, which is a very big difference in culture. Because here, if any like major media would try to do that, the big story would be, we found out somebody's lying. But it doesn't matter. So
I've always wondered about that, yeah, because Eric Bischoff in his book was like, yeah, Japanese people actually believe wrestling's real. But I think he misunderstood that cultural difference, where the fact that the news reports about it as if it was real and that people play along in that way and aren't constantly talking about how it's fake doesn't mean that they actually think that it's real. But I don't know, Dave, do you have any insight into that? Into like what, like the casual or the typical Japanese wrestling fan, what attitude they have towards wrestling? Like what they think it is?
Oh yeah, that I couldn't tell you.
Okay, that's fair. I will say that the makeup of the crowd was in these matches that we're watching, which are fairly old by now, like it's different than the kind of crowd you'd see in America. And the kind of crowd you see in America, it's very like, it's an entertainment, it's a very pop culture entertainment crowd with people like yelling and screaming. And not that the crowd kept quiet in this match, but like in the front row in this match, you see like several guys in tuxedos coming, because it's a formal event, which is more something you'd see in America in like a high-end boxing match.
And you'll always have those girls that are screaming a wrestler's name out in the crowd.
In their defense, I don't know how many of them were yelling for Kobashi, but man, Kenta Kobashi in the 90s was a frighteningly handsome man. I gotta say, I mean, if you were gonna make a Superman, with a Japanese actor, I think you'd have to get a guy who looks like Kenta Kobashi in this time. Especially he's got the hair, the Clark Kent hair swoop.
It's
good stuff.
It's a great contrast with Misawa, who's just like this kind of doughy little frog-faced guy. And then, of course, as soon as he does anything, it's incredible. But it's totally surprising from first glance.
Was his level of high flying unusual for the time?
For a heavyweight.
For a heavyweight, that's another thing about the psychology traditionally of wrestling in Japan, is that heavyweights and like light heavyweights are much more strictly divided by competition division, not necessarily by weight, because light heavyweights will often move to heavyweight if they feel like they've dominated the heavyweight division. That's a more recent occurrence. More often back then, a light heavyweight, if they became a big enough star, like both Misawa and Kobashi did earlier in their careers, they'll just gain weight. And it's not like in America where we have this obsession with gigantic muscles and chiseled abs. It was just like, well, I weigh 215 pounds and I need to gain 10 pounds. Let's eat a bunch of rice. Let's go. I'm going to eat 6,000 calories a day. Let's pour a bunch of various fats on it. And then you get that gut, and now you're a heavyweight.
So speaking of which, it occurred to me watching the other match that we'll get into later. But I've always been of the impression that in the 90s, All Japan had the great heavyweights. And New Japan was really good with the juniors, with the light heavyweights. But their heavyweights were they had some good characters like Muta and Chono, but their heavyweight matches were kind of clunky and boring. Do you think that's true, Dave?
Yeah, I'm not as into the New Japan heavyweights. There was a period of time where I really loved Shinya Hashimoto.
Mm-hmm.
I would watch New Japan for the juniors and to see Hashimoto kick ass. Okay. That was my thing on New Japan. But you didn't
have this whole set of great talents like you did in All Japan.
Right.
Well, they call these guys the four pillars of All Japan. And it's because the four of them were all so excellent and they interacted with each other so much and, et cetera, et cetera. They held up All Japan until they decided not to anymore. And you can kind of draw a straight line from All Japan crumbling to the pillars, like stopping holding the load.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I want to get
they broke down. But, yeah, for later.
So getting into this match specifically, so this is from June 9th, 1995. One other question about belts. So Misawa and Kobashi are the tag champs going into this.
Right.
They each have 2 belts as well. What is the tag title for?
Right. So that was the All Japan Double World Tag Team titles. So one was the NWA International Tag Team titles, I believe. And the other one, oh man, I didn't do my research on this.
That's all right.
Look, I'm not really sure is a perfectly acceptable answer. You probably know more than a lot of our listeners, and you can give us whatever you got. And if you don't have it, we'll all just have a good time not knowing together. So don't worry too much about it.
This podcast comes with a lot more homework than you would expect to have to do for a podcast.
The other one was the PWF Tag Team Championship.
Okay, cool.
I always think that it's funny that the NWA would just create these titles and then send them to Japan or send them to Mexico, and then they would just have a life of their own, just out there. They'd become part of a double or a triple title, or just be forgotten altogether. That was always very odd.
And the NWA forms 2/3 of that Triple Crown.
Oh, wow.
All right, there you go.
Yeah, the third title that escaped me, talking about the Triple Crown, that was the NWA UN title.
NWA UN title?
Yes.
All right.
Uh,
An attempt at world diplomacy.
Well, the National Wrestling Alliance was really quite international. And when it, like, that's the thing, the NWA never actually dissolved. It still exists. But to compare what the NWA is now to what it actually was is kind of a fallacy. But when the NWA, as we knew it, stopped having any power, all of these belts just still existed and are still just being defended everywhere, with little to no authority behind them except for these names. And like, so it was kind of advantageous for All Japan that like it became the Triple Crown as its own title with 3 belts, because as the NWA fell, the Triple Crown could maintain its prestige.
It's funny to think about, like, oh, the belt still exists.
Yeah.
There's no authority behind it. I mean, it also was a made-up authority.
Yeah.
For a made-up belt anyway, but now that the made-up authority's gone, we can't just have the made-up belt.
That's some of the craziest stuff about professional wrestling in general, though, you know? Like,
And the financial system. That's how money works too, right?
yes.
That is exactly the same way that money works.
Because the NWA,
as we're all really learning
the
now.
NWA essentially was a cartel. And once the cartel stopped having any power to actually mark territory and keep people from doing business anywhere, it had no power over anything other than like some trademarks and owning a few rings and owning a few belts and telling wrestlers who's gonna win and lose them. But in the mid 20th,
And that's why they're going to put Vince McMahon in charge of the Federal Reserve.
yes, exactly, he'll convince us all everything's fine. The NWA champion used to have to put up a hefty deposit to the NWA. Like, the numbers, everybody says a different number. Let's say $20,000. It's in the ballpark of $20,000. And when you won the title, you had to give the NWA a deposit of $20,000 so that you didn't just go into business for yourself with the NWA championship. So you didn't accept money from a rogue promoter to drop the belt to their guy. This all ended very poorly for the NWA, as I know this is a bit of a sidetrack, but I think it's a great story. In it was 1990. I think it was 1990. 1990. Ric Flair was the
Rick Flair and Jim Herd
Yeah.
story.
Ric Flair was the NWA champion, and the ownership, the ownership of WCW, which housed the NWA title, went to Ted Turner completely, and the president of the company title changed hands several
Like
times.
Ted Turner himself was the champion.
No, he-
Because that I would have watched.
He owned
that.
the company because he always was very loyal to wrestling, because in the 70s, like, Southern wrestling was on the original TBS and it kept his business afloat. Anyway, 1989, they kept changing who was in charge of the company, like the president of the company within the giant Turner corporate structure. And the guy, Jim Herd, decided that Ric Flair is too old and he had to shuffle off. But he couldn't decide who he was going to lose the championship to. So his contract was coming up, and he was like, okay, you're going to lose the title to Barry Windham at this show. Flair said, fine. I'll lose to Barry Windham. I'll lose to whoever you want. I'll get out of here. And then he's like, okay, no. You're going to lose to Lex Luger at this other show. And Flair's like, okay, great. I don't care. I'll just lose the title. Flair was a professional. He'll lose to everybody all day long. That's not the point. Then they called him again and said, okay, Ric Flair, we decided we just don't want to use you anymore. So we're just going to strip you of the title. You're free to do what you want. He signed with the WWF immediately. And they said, okay, well, you just have to send us back the belt. And Flair said, okay, I'll send you back the belt as soon as I get my $20,000 deposit back. To which Jim Herd said, what $20,000 deposit? Because nobody told him about that, because they had nothing to do with the NWA. But Ric Flair did pay a $20,000 deposit for that belt. So they went back and forth about it, and Flair was just like, no, screw you, this is my belt. So he calls up Vince McMahon and says, all right, I'm coming in, right? And Vince is like, yep. And he says, well, I have this belt, and I haven't lost it to anybody. And I can't be on your television for the next 90 days. And Vince is like, great, just send the belt. So he sent the belt, and then one day on television, Bobby Heenan had a belt bag, and he was like, hey, Gorilla Monsoon, you know how Hulk Hogan's the champion? And this girl's like, yeah. And he's like, well, guess who's showing up? And then he just pulls out the belt. And the wrestling world lost its friggin' mind because there was only one thing that could mean. And that's, that's the drama that happens when made-up titles are run by made-up companies that nobody knows what's going on with. When Flair...
The debut of the real world's champion.
Right, that's what he referred to himself as. I'm the real world's champion. He says in the end, when he left the WWF, he did end up returning the belt, and he got his deposit back with interest, and everybody was happy, except for Jim Herd, who left the company quickly. All right, so about some Japanese wrestling. I had to get onto that, because that's a great story.
So All Japan Pro Wrestling, that was started by Giant Baba, right?
Correct.
Yes.
Taue actually kind of reminds me of Giant Baba. He's
Yeah, a little
Yes.
bit.
like a younger.
The overhead chops to the head.
Right,
Yeah.
which did it like all these guys are known for their like really brutal strikes, like Kobashi's chops and Kawada's kicks and Misawa's elbows. And then Taue does these overhand chops that look totally ineffectual and bullshit.
Giant
Misawa-
Boba's
Deal with that.
influence.
For the influence from Baba.
Yep. As well as the red trunks.
Yeah.
So along those lines, this is known, the style that Baba created, that's like the All Japan style, is known as the King's Road style.
Right.
Right? And that's to be contrasted with the New Japan strong style that Antonio Inoki.
Right.
So what, I guess the strong style we know is like characterized by the hard hitting
Hard hitting along with the mat technique.
and mat technique.
Really more portrayed as like trying to be more realistic.
Got you.
Yeah.
And so what is the King's Road style? How would you characterize that?
King's Road was more like how much can you take
Okay.
and like dish back, really.
Well, one thing I noticed watching this match that I mentioned before we started recording, and a difference between the way the American audiences respond to the action and the Japanese audience here responds to it. And I think this is to the point that the whole style isn't based around what you can do, but more what can be done to you. Is that in America, the crowd would pop gigantic when you do a big spectacular spot and everyone takes a bump. Whereas in Japan, everyone pops big when somebody does a big, powerful move and their opponent powers through and doesn't go down. Or they go down and then they get back up. The whole time selling, I've taken this pain and I'm not going to let it beat me.
And that'll be portrayed. We will be discussing that in the tag match. We will be
Oh, yes.
discussing now.
Yeah, get into it, Dave. Who plays that role, or where do we see that in this match?
Okay, so Misawa and Kobashi are both going in with injuries. Kobashi had that
Oh, yeah.
his leg heavily taped up going into this match, right? Misawa actually was wrestling with a broken orbital bone, which he suffered a couple of months prior.
AKA a broken face, as we
Yes.
learned when talking about the
Broken
Undertaker.
face.
Yeah.
Yes. So
That's the
it
face
looked
bone.
so
The orbital.
simple. Just like Kawada just gave him a running kick to the face and broke his orbital bone that way.
Wait, in this match?
No.
Oh,
It was
okay.
the match 2 months prior. It was during the Champions Carnival, which was the big annual singles tournament that All Japan would have every year.
Is that the match that Meltzer gave 6 stars out of 5?
That
Was that his
one,
first
no, that was
six-star?
from June 3rd, 94.
Okay.
So, yeah, they had a lot of matches.
Right.
Yes.
And so, yeah, I was actually going to ask about that. So Americans, I think probably because of the Ring of Honor presence, tend to think about Misawa and Kobashi, and maybe also because of what they did in Pro Wrestling Noah later on, as like the feud of this period. But
Oh,
really,
right.
it's Misawa and Kawada, right? That's kind of really the central rivalry here.
Oh, and definitely. And yeah, they had rivalry going for well over 2 years now at that point.
At the point of this tag match.
Right.
So you mentioned Kawada kicking Misawa. I just wanted to, on like a kind of personal note. So I don't know if you were at this one. Doc and I, one of those ROH shows at Basketball City, there was a tag team match between Bryan Danielson and Samoa Joe against Kenta and Marufuji. right? And Kenta and Marufuji are like the next generation that were like trained by Kobashi and Misawa. And one of my favorite moments from that match, and we like popped huge for it when it happened, was Kenta just, he's in the ring with Bryan Danielson, and all of a sudden he runs over to the corner and kicks Joe in the head and knocks him off the apron. It was like, oh, what a dick. And I noticed in this match, that's what Kawada does, first to Misawa and then Kobashi.
Right.
It really establishes his
Yeah.
character well, right, as this upstart, which was he finally pinned Misawa at this point, right?
Yeah, Misawa didn't get pinned a whole lot for a lot of years. It was always very notable when he lost a fall.
Misawa does an actual fighting game move in this match.
The spin kick?
He does a full spinning headbutt at somebody. He launches himself at somebody else and
Yeah.
spins a couple times, corkscrews in the air, and strikes them with his head, and then falls to the ground. It was magical.
Yeah, the guys that programmed all those great fighting games in the second half of the 90s were watching Misawa.
That totally makes sense.
That's a puzzle piece to fall into place. They were watching these guys.
One thing I love about the dives is they're set up very logically. Like, it's not like in the
Yes.
indies where, like, you knock the guy on the outside and then he just stands there and waits to be plancha'd.
Clap, 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 jump, jump, ropes. Falling on the 6 guys who were staring at you the whole time are more likely missing them all, and then they all take bumps anyway.
No, it had to be like a strategic thing where finally Kobashi was able to get his hands on Kawada outside of the ring so that Misawa could dive on him.
It made sense, and it made more sense to me that they did them relatively early in the match when they had like energy and weren't injured, as opposed to saving it for a giant high spot at the end of the match when how come you're jumping over the top rope at the end of the match? Yeah. Especially a match that goes over 45 minutes where you're already quite injured and tired.
At the same time, they built up really well to the Kobashi moonsault.
Yes, the Kobashi moonsault.
When it happened, it had maximum impact.
He looked like he was already getting a little too big to be doing the Kobashi moonsault, but he nailed it.
So also about like logical stuff. So I really liked how, Kawada and Taue are basically the heels here, but it's not like they do a whole bunch of over the top cheating. All they do is target Kobashi's leg.
As well as Misawa's face.
Oh, and
Yeah,
Misawa's
Misawa's
face.
face.
Right, I didn't pick up on that. Yeah.
And the crowd did. I did notice that, even though I wasn't aware of the injury. Couple times they go after Misawa's face, and the crowd is like, oh, because it's a dirty move to go after somebody's injury, which is the level of subtlety that they're able to achieve, because that's a level of subtlety they've educated their audience to expect.
And also in a much more kind of honor-bound culture.
Exactly.
I wish I had known more of this backstory. Because I kind of watched it cold and was trying to figure out the through line. And I did notice, it built in a way that I really enjoyed. It took, it was a little long for my taste. I stick to my 35-minute rule for matches.
I gotta say,
But it built in a way that I thought was really, and once it started really rolling for me, I thought it did a good job of propelling itself and being genuinely exciting. But it felt like it took a long time to get there, and maybe if I had been more aware of the backstory going in, it would have been
the moment where like Misawa is done taking Kawada's shit, and he's just like stomping him in the corner, and all of a sudden he starts blocking. It's like, well, kind of like, why didn't you do that before? But like now he has the power, and he starts blocking and stands up in the corner, and then fights back. But for the drama of it, it was perfect.
Now, the drama of it worked very well. The way that the way Kobashi signals about 20 minutes in, oh no, my leg actually just gave out.
Yeah.
I thought was very well done because it wasn't off of some crazy move. Again, he was kind of on offense, and he like threw a kick or something, and something went wrong, and he just fell over and grabbed his leg, and the complexion of the match changed from there. That was a clear weak spot from there on out.
And Taue very much takes advantage, like kind
Very
of choke
much.
slamming Misawa, like choke pushing him right onto Kobashi's leg. And the sound the audience makes is incredible there. They're just like totally outraged.
Kawada follows up, coming off the second rope with the knee right onto his leg, and then again the crowd gasps in horror.
It's like, this isn't competition. You're trying to end this man's career. That's not what we paid to see. You want to see a
Indeed.
championship match? Well, they certainly got one.
In general, when we watch matches in Japan, the crowd reactions are much more effective punctuations because it feels like there's a lot less of the general noise. I guess American audiences, everybody's just fucking making sounds with their face, just ambient sound with their face while match, and then it kind of goes up and down with the match. Whereas in it seems like the Japanese matches, people are like watching, and then they react when something happens, and then they go back to paying attention.
It's especially true nowadays where wrestling audiences, not only are they all making noise, but they're also trying to get themselves over, like trying to come up with clever chants that everyone else will start chanting, or like. So yeah, they're much less active and much less reactive.
And once again, the most you get of that in Japan are like girls screaming the names of the wrestlers they think are cute, which you do hear several, like you pointed out, Dave. You do hear several just high-pitched Misawas, because he was the guy there, as much as Kobashi was certainly more attractive. Misawa was already pretty godlike at the time. People really worshipped him. They continued to worship him until he passed away, and he was good. He was fantastic. The way he could just portray all of the emotions with the same couple of facial expressions, which sounds like I'm joking, but I'm not. Because he didn't have a wide range of facial expressions, but he knew how to hit the ones that he had, so that you knew, like, if he was in pain, if he thought he had the upper hand, where he was coming from, what was going to happen next. And the fact that he kind of looked like he couldn't move, but he could move in any way he wanted to, which made everything he did look more impressive.
Oh yeah, Misawa was definitely a more stoic type. Just seeing his facial expressions out of his mostly stoic demeanor is quite amazing.
The story element that really hits me the most here is Kobashi desperately trying to protect Misawa.
Oh yes,
Fighting through the opposition in order to save him, throwing his body on top of him to defend him from further damage. That was really touching, I felt.
Right.
You don't get those kinds of really bold expressions of camaraderie in American wrestling.
No, not like that. Not I'm throwing my body over my partner's body because you shouldn't keep hitting him now. Clearly, you just threw him on the floor, I think for the first time Kobashi covered his partner was when they choke slammed him off the apron.
Right.
And by the pace of the match, it would have made sense if they took a couple of minutes to make sure he was okay, but they didn't. Taue and Kawada start putting the boots to him, and Kobashi runs in and doesn't try to fight them off. He just covers Misawa with his own body to take the kicks himself, because at the moment he could take it more.
This is why, even though I have barely seen them at all and I have not seen any of their matches, one of my favorite gimmicks ever is the Best Friends.
Yeah.
Just because there should be more wrestling tag teams that, like, they're best friends.
Yeah.
That's very wholesome.
Yes.
It's very warm. There should be more wholesomeness in wrestling of that sort, while still maintaining, the violence.
Oh, you're right.
Or what we described last episode, or one of these episodes, as not actually violence.
The simulated
the brutality,
violence.
Yeah. So going back to the story of the match, so then after, when Kobashi's throwing his body on top of Misawa's to defend him, so then it's up to Taue and Kawada to beat the shit out of Kobashi to take him out of the equation so they can have Misawa to themselves, and that's exactly what they do. And then finally they have Misawa to themselves for long enough and hit him with enough extremely dangerous backdrop drivers and power bombs that they're able to pin him. Man, and this was just the beginning, right? This was the beginning of the ramping up of the head drops. Like, we're not at peak All Japan head drops at this point.
Watching the backdrops in 95, you see they're still just landing on their necks. They didn't start landing on their heads until the year after.
There were so many times where a man threw another man onto his neck
in this match.
Yeah.
That's really the
So many
emblematic thing of this style.
Right. It was not only was that like a thing that really appealed to the emerging hardcore American market of tape traders, but it ended up being the worst thing to come out of that style. A lot of people got really injured. Many years later, Misawa died in the ring after taking one of those.
Because his spinal
Oh,
column was no longer connected to his brain.
Yeah.
Jesus.
That's that was in What year was that in? Was that in 09?
Oh, 09, yep.
Was that in 09? Yeah. Very bad scene. He probably should have retired by then for a variety of reasons, but he did not.
It's so fucking sad because the crowd is like chanting for him to get up like they
Right.
would normally do in a match where he was taking heat, and
Yeah.
he just didn't get up that time.
No, he just didn't get up that time.
I wonder what that says about the cultural differences between Japan and America, that over there they kept up the horrifying neck injuries until it was far, far too late. And over here, we did that with concussions.
Yeah.
Although I'm sure concussions were also a huge problem in Japanese wrestling.
I'm sure. But we had a lot of neck injuries in America too. Part of like when they established the wellness policy in the WWE was to cut down on neck injuries, and it worked. If you look at a lot of the guys that were big stars in America in like the early 2000s and the late 90s, a lot of them had like spinal fusion surgery, which is a fairly drastic measure, but a very effective one, where they fuse a couple of discs in your neck that had been broken, and then the results vary a little bit, but usually you lose some of the flexibility in your neck, but you also gain a lot of safety. You should also probably stop wrestling if you get one of those forever.
I'm going to modify my theory, and instead of saying, oh, there's an interesting cultural difference,
Yeah.
I'm just going to say, don't be a professional wrestler, guys. No, I'm sorry, Doc. I'm sorry if that's
It's
insulting,
okay,
but
it's
just if you're
okay, it's
listening to
not.
this, don't do, which is, I know of at least 5 wrestlers who listen to this, and look, I love you guys. I'm worried. I'm very worried about you.
I've been in wrestling a long time, and I've learned from a lot of people. I've never heard anybody say it was a good idea.
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
It's more like something you just feel like you have to get
No,
involved
I
in.
respect, I get
That
that.
being said, like just to speak to my own personal wrestling style, and like I don't have that many matches. I'm mostly a talker, but I try very hard not to land on my head or my neck a lot. It has happened once or twice, but I don't think I've ever gotten any concussions, and that's a lucky thing. And part of that, it's like if you want to book me for a match, I can be very entertaining. I'm mostly goofy faces and punches and kicks. And that's fine.
It is kind of fucked up to think about how, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like that you sort of had to close some doors on possibilities in
Yeah.
your career by making the conscious choice. I'm not going to land on my neck so much.
It is, but I'm happy with the decision.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm glad that you made that
Yeah.
decision. I'm just saying it's screwed up that that's what the business is.
He's also not cutting himself up with light tubes.
Right. I'm also not cutting myself up with
Though
light
that's
tubes.
probably less dangerous.
The light tubes thing, it's most dangerous if you breathe in the residue, I guess. But yeah, one of the big secrets of the light tube spot is that it doesn't hurt that much. And, unless it really cuts you up, you're probably fine. It just bursts, which is why we saw those matches with those guys hitting each other with dozens of light tubes, wincing a little and then moving on.
Right.
There are no light
wanted to
tubes
talk
in
a
this
little-
match. In fact, they've done such a
No.
good job overall in All Japan that you get real heat just for being kind of unsportsmanlike, which if you haven't noticed yet, I'm a big fan of that psychology, because the more you can get over just being kind of unsportsmanlike, the less ridiculous crap you have to do.
True. I mean,
Yeah.
just the heat Kawada got just for kicking this out in his broken face, off a knee drop to an injured leg.
Oh yeah, just kicking Kobashi in the leg, they got so much heat.
There's not as much blood in Japanese wrestling, right?
Well, not in this Japanese wrestling. Big Japan wrestling, and there were a number of deathmatch leagues that we covered a little bit when we were talking about Mick Foley. They are the progenitors of the deathmatch.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, FMW, Frontier Martial Arts Wrestling,
FMW,
was
that was
a
the
big
other one,
bloody thing, but it was a niche product. It remains a niche product. And although people would bleed in the major leagues in Japan, it never got to be like a regular thing the way sometimes it had become in America.
The King of the Death match was in a big place.
Yeah.
That was like, was that the
Huge
Dome?
stadium. I don't know. They change the name of that place every few years. I'm not really sure.
Before we delve into the bad match for today,
Yep.
which I am very excited
Yeah.
about.
I think you nailed it with this one,
Dave.
Dave.
Yeah. Dave, what was the reason that it was this match that you wanted to bring out of all the matches? The good one.
Well, it's my favorite all-time pro wrestling match. There was so much like details of storytelling in this. I'll go as far as saying, if you watch Game of Thrones, All Japan is like the Game of Thrones of pro wrestling. There's layers upon layers of storytelling with that all comes to fruition in this particular match.
On the Game of Thrones thing, like they all come from these different legacies too, right? Like it's not just these wrestlers, but kind of like who they were trained by and who they represent and all of that
Well,
also feeding into it.
I'd say with the whole like faction warfare, I would say you could kind of say that, yes. I mean, Misawa, Kawada, and Kobashi, they were allies at one point, and then they were all out adversaries after 2 or 3 years.
How did Misawa and Kobashi end up falling out?
Oh, that as far as that wasn't quite as explicit as how Misawa and Kawada fell out, so I don't really have an answer for Misawa and Kobashi as like I would have for Misawa and Kawada.
Just more like continuing competitiveness
Continue competitive.
over the titles.
They were very long-term rivals. I don't think it was much of a, screw you feud, more that as time went on, it was clear that they were like the 2 top dogs in Japan. And occasionally you got to see who's number one. And it was almost always Misawa.
That's another real difference with like American wrestling. Like in American wrestling, there would have to be some despicable thing that Kawada did to Misawa that made Kawada the heel and them no longer not like each other, right? Whereas in Puro, it can be a lot more subtle how these relationships change.
Right. It's more of a rivalry rather than a blood feud. Fuck you, I'm going to beat the shit out of you because I don't like you anymore, kind of whatever.
Right, exactly.
It's less petty than
Yeah.
than the American style, where the American style would just be like, "Oh, you fucking said I was dumb. You're dumb. I'm just fucking kill you."
Yeah, almost.
And here it's a bit more of like a
Right.
sportsman, like it's presented as a little realer or a little more
Right.
respectable.
In America, almost every major match is like these 2 guys wanted to fight, so the league booked it, as opposed to a sports-like product where these 2 guys want to fight, and then one day, when it's logical through the sports, if they happen to be booked against each other, the crowd thinks it's cool, which makes it like a real sports rivalry. Like, when the Yankees and the Red Sox have a baseball game, all the Yankees fans and the Red Sox fans are paying close attention. But that doesn't mean Major League Baseball is going to have them have 15 games a year. They're just going to have the games when they're on the schedule. And that makes them more exciting because that's when they come along.
Yeah, I felt Ring of Honor did that really well too, where like just because 2 people were feuding, they weren't going to wrestle on every single show. And they weren't necessarily going to be the main event. They weren't necessarily going to be the ones to beat each other for the title. They had their problem with one another and it manifested however it did, given that they were in a wrestling league together. With Kawada, so eventually Misawa and Kobashi and Taue all leave All Japan to start Pro Wrestling Noah,
Right.
And that's in 2001?
2000.
In 2000.
It was in
2000.
June or July of 2000 that they had that mass exodus.
Why did they do that? They weren't getting paid enough, or
Misawa had an ongoing beef with Giant Baba's widow, Makoto Baba, and they were butting heads. And then Misawa just had enough and took practically the whole roster with him.
But not Kawada.
Not Kawada. Kawada swore allegiance to All Japan, along with
I see.
Masafuchi and referee Koiwada.
That's not a lot on his side.
Yeah.
That's not a lot. No.
So I guess that's part of why Kawada kind of didn't like become as much of a legend, or like people don't really talk about him, at least in the States, as much as they did as they do Misawa and Kobashi. I guess maybe part of it is also his character, right? Like part of the whole point of his rivalry with Misawa is that he's not getting the same kind of fanfare really that Misawa's getting, right? And I guess because he's kind of just not as charismatic and like good looking of a dude or something like, does that have something to do with it?
Not as good looking of a dude, yes.
Well, the girls were screaming for Misawa.
But Kawada, I think, is the guy who's known as like more of an innovator in a lot of ways. Like his kicks, the Kawada kicks, and the. Did he come up with the capo kick, or was that Liger?
Liger did that before Kawada did.
So we should move on. I don't expect we'll have as long of a conversation about this next match, but we should get to it. And Dave, would you please introduce us to this? Because this looked like it could be on the undercard of a B-level WWF pay-per-view from the late 90s.
Yes, so Masa Saito versus the Great Kojika. So the thing behind the Great Kojika was...
So this is New Japan versus BJW.
Correct.
Versus Big Japan.
Versus Big Japan. Some kind of big event they put on in 97 at the Tokyo Dome.
Right. So they had a series of matches against each other, and this, I believe, was the last one of the series.
Was this the main event of the whole show?
No. Thank fucking God.
No.
I was about to say, like, oh man, Masa Saito is like a legendary wrestler, right?
Right.
He came up with the Saito suplex.
That he did.
Is he the one who? There's one of the participants in this match is the most representative of the word burly of anybody I've ever seen, where he is just like, I just look at him and it's like I don't know where him being buff ends and where him being fat begins.
His arms have pecs.
That's Saito.
Yeah.
He is an angry sphere of a man.
Yes.
So who is Kojiko? This man with red hair in a tuxedo with a vest of hand grenades on top of the tuxedo that
Wesley
he comes
Snipes.
out wearing.
It's a little bit of a Wesley Snipes vibe.
Wesley Snipes?
Yeah, I don't know. I got that. I got a little bit of that.
I believe he was the co-founder of Big Japan. Co-founder of Big Japan, and he had been retired for over 10 years, I believe, and then would come out of retirement so often wrestling in a tux.
And we use the word wrestling generously.
Why is he wrestling Masa Saito on this show?
He was penciled in as a substitute, I believe.
Ah, right. Dan Severn
Somebody
couldn't make it.
else.
So
Okay, so I guess even though he's not much of a wrestler at this point in his career, just the fact that he's the co-founder of Big Japan means that people might want to see him get beat up or something. Were Big Japan kind of the heels in this whole thing? Or?
And I guess you could kind of say that. Yeah. It wasn't much of a backstory to get me to really care.
Okay. My favorite part of this match is the referee, who does a great job of intimidating Kojika.
Yeah, that was great.
Like slapping him in the
yes.
head when he's choking Saito with the chain, which was his only effective offense. I mean, I was thinking, hey, ref, like, let him use the chain. He doesn't have a chance.
Where did that
otherwise.
chain come from? Where did he get that?
yeah, where did that chain come from?
Did he take it out of his pocket?
I guess he had a lot of places to hide stuff in that tuxedo and vest covered in hand grenades.
I mean, as the ref, you are supposed to check the person before.
He was trying to get him to take his tuxedo off, I think for that purpose. He clearly did not trust Kojika.
And which is where most of the stalling came about in this match.
Right, bell to bell, this match was about 7 minutes, and about 5 of it was Kojika standing there and trying not to get into it.
And the crowd got restless, and he flipped them off.
Yeah. It's unusual to hear a Japanese crowd that displeased with what's going on. Like not just like hating a villain, but like really not happy with what they're seeing.
What does
whatsoever.
stalling serve in a wrestling match? Like, why stall and not do anything else that if you need like, I get if you need a break or something like that. Like, what's the? I guess it's just to build heat for the heel.
Yeah, if you're a heel, the more you frustrate your opponent, they want to see you get beat up. The more you keep that from them, the more they're going to hate you, and the happier they'll be when you finally do get beat up. But there's a limit, you know?
Yeah, there's a difference between stalling as a performative function and doing nothing. The most boring match I think I've ever seen, which I don't think we'll ever watch on this show. I saw on the WWE
Ciampa Gargano,
Network.
we did watch it.
No, boring. A lot of stuff happened in that match. It was just
The movie,
kind of...
the cinematic one, I was...
So it's a WWE Classics house show match. I can't remember who one of the participants in it was. It was Special Delivery Jones and somebody. It might have been Johnny Rods. And you know I love Johnny. But the match, it was a 20-minute time limit, and almost the entire match, they just held each other on the mat in headlocks. It was clearly the opening match. They were waiting for people to file in, and it was just like headlock, 5-minute headlock spot. They get up, hammerlock, headlock takeover, 5-minute headlock spot, ring the bell. All right. And that was the most boring match I've ever seen. That wasn't stalling. That was just doing nothing. Stalling... With stalling, you're still trying to affect an emotion in the audience because the whole thing is affecting emotion in the audience, really.
Yeah, there was one instance of stalling that didn't bore me. It was actually from this year, from Kenta versus Tetsuya Naito.
Oh,
I haven't
And-
seen that match yet. I've been waiting to watch it.
I want to see it.
The beginning of that match was an absolute stall fest.
Yeah? Go ahead and, what was...
Yeah, talk about it if you want.
What was going on?
That much was memorable, and just after they actually finally got into it, the match rocked.
So I guess it was Naito stall. Oh no, Kenta would be stalling. Naito's
Kenta was
babyface.
stalling like crazy.
Interesting.
Not that Naito doesn't know how to stall. One of his moves is literally feigning going to sleep.
So Doc mentioned that this match could have been on, a late '90s WWF mid card kind of situation.
This could have been Al Snow versus Pat Patterson. Like it was goofy, and Kojika knew his role. If he could ever wrestle, he knew not to show it because that was not his role in this match. J.J. Dillon said that when they had him wrestle a few matches when he was managing the Horsemen, like he was like, I'll show them I can wrestle, and he wrestled a good match, and the promoter came to him and was like, what the hell are you doing? You're playing the role of the goofy manager. Play like you're the goofy manager. And that's kind of what Kojika did. He riled up the crowd. He gave the crowd the finger. He got some ill-gotten offense, and then he got his ass handed to him. And that was that.
So this more kind of like entertainment style wrestling match, is this uncommon for Japan at that time? Or like, how often would you see something like this, do you think?
That was a rarity. I did not see much of that stall fest happen in the shows I've seen.
The crowd was not happy with it. That's not what they came to see.
Is this like how did you come upon this match? Is it like a famously bad
I was
match?
just blazing through some just New Japan stuff, and I just happened to trip across this match. Really,
Definitely shattered my idea because I had come off the last match being like, I guess Japanese wrestling is just generally a little more real presenting than American wrestling, and then I watched this and I'm like, okay, well, never mind on that. it's like, oh, it's so much more like respectable, and
You see, that right there is why Japanese wrestling fans hate this kind of thing. because they watch Japanese wrestling. Some of them watch Japanese wrestling because Japanese wrestling is actually a very wide palette. But a lot of them watch this style of Japanese wrestling because it does a much better job of keeping the illusion of respectable competition. So when something like this happens, it completely shatters it. It's insulting the intelligence of the people that want to see it. It would have fit in the mid-card of the WWF during the Attitude Era because that's what those fans were educated to. The fans here were educated to competition. This was not competition.
A lot of the critics of Japanese wrestling these days really hate. So, ever since the introduction of the Bullet Club and a lot of the Westerners into New Japan, Westerners using like cheating kinds of Western style heel tactics. A lot of the critics really hate that stuff, or at least the overuse of it, right? Because it turns the product into something more like the WWE with a lot of bullshit endings and things like that, and less of that presentation of realistic competition.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. I remember the Bullet Club coming into play back in 2013, and all the incessant interference, and oh yeah, I hated it.
You hated it? So
Oh yeah.
And do you think that it's been a detriment to New Japan these years?
Not in the extent of bringing a wider audience, no.
But for your personal enjoyment.
My personal enjoyment, I don't like outside interference like taking place so much.
Both takes are certainly valid.
I wanted to ask you about the one guy in New Japan because this match reminded me of him, Toru Yano.
Oh yes.
So he's kind of like the like comic relief of New Japan,
right?
And I remember you really hating him, and then kind of coming around to him a little bit. So you tell us a little bit of that story?
Oh yes, Toru Yano. Unlike Kojika, he made the comedy work.
Right.
So yeah.
Eventually. Right.
Right.
Has there been like a change in his antics for the better?
Yeah, he was a more comedic, took on a more comedic approach, whereas back when I really hated him, like all I saw was just incessant cheating.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's the main thing that you don't like.
Right.
The cheating.
Well, I think New Japan books him really well now, where like once a year he'll beat like one of the top guys, period, shrug like, oh yeah, no, I mean, I'm actually pretty good, and then he runs away. It just keeps his heat. He does a really good act, but it's an act.
I really love his series of matches with Omega. With Kenny Omega.
Omega knew what he was. Omega gets that kind of thing. So Omega can do all points in this spectrum. And we covered that on the podcast. He can do the complete unrealistic bullshit. And he can also have the really sharp 60-minute wrestling match. He's just so versatile. I know we're gonna run up against our time barrier pretty soon. I want to get Evan's general impressions of both of these matches just as a fairly concise thing. Like, what did you think of the super serious tag match, and what did you think of this goofy
The
second
super
match?
serious tag match reminded me a little bit of reading like classic literature, where because I have a 20th/21st century attention span, like the first few hundred pages when you're like forcing yourself to read a classic Russian novel or something, you're like, oh my God, why am I doing this to myself? But then when it all comes together, it's like done in this way that's very masterful. It makes the whole thing sort of worth it. And it's just hard to carve out the time and focus to do that in your life. And yeah, so I guess I'm saying this reminded me of, I don't know, Tolstoy. In that,
Dostoevsky.
or Dostoevsky. In that,
I think you got it.
But
actually, I think you
in
got
that
it.
because it was, and like I said, if I had had more context, it maybe would have been better. But it was hard for me to find the through line early on. It was hard for me to see. It was like sort of just seemed like a series of brief exchanges between people who were talented, certainly, but I couldn't really sink my teeth into it at first. And then, but it really started to, when it started to pick up, it started to pull me in. yeah, I guess it was all. I guess the thing that is cool about it is also sort of to its detriment, in that because it is more it is presented as more of a athletic contest, and it is presented as more of a quote unquote legit thing. The fact that they are not characters. I don't know. I guess I'm sort of used now to watching wrestling where they're more characters, or the more recent NJPW stuff, where they seem to have really grasped that a lot more, or started doing that a lot more.
I think they do have fairly clear characters. They're just much more subtly presented, right? They're not gimmicks. They're not even like the over-the-top kind of hard-to-describe gimmick of a Randy Savage or something like that. They're, I don't know, I think they're closer to just kind of like archetypal personalities, almost.
Yeah, more like a personality. Yeah, like Kobashi showed it in this tag match where he's just doesn't back down, and very fierce competitor, and
who defends his friend.
well, when he got that hot tag and like they're trying to target his leg again, and you just see him shrug it off, that facial expression, just that look of determination that describes Kobashi in a nutshell.
His face.
Yeah, and then Kawada, I just describe him as one of the more surly type. As there's definite character to each of these wrestlers.
Yeah, I guess maybe just the fact that it is presented more subtly, and I'm just more used to American wrestling, where they're like, he's the rich guy. Do you get it?
Exactly. Yeah, they don't do that in classical Japanese wrestling. And like I said, this is just one match. It's a great match, but it's hopefully you get the idea that it's truly a completely different style. Modern New Japan has a lot of American wrestling influence.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
although it is still very different than modern American.
Well, I was
wrestling.
gonna say, that's it's interesting to watch. Think of a later match I've watched, where something with Shinsuke Nakamura, where he comes out with this unbelievable presentation and wailing guitar solos and stuff, and then gets in the ring, and then he still is a character in the ring, but it is also subtle in comparison, I guess, to some other American wrestling. I don't know. The second match, it was fun to watch. A strong fat guy beat up a guy who seemed like he sucked, I guess. I don't know.
Saito looked really unpleased to be involved. Like, he taps him out with the ankle lock, and then he just like, this fucking shit. What am I doing here?
Even the ankle lock looked bad.
It looked like he was trying not to hurt the guy.
Yeah, he didn't really care about putting it on.
This was the right combination of short enough and bad enough where it was fun to watch.
Like Dave, the first bad match that we watched ended up just being so long, and it was at the Survivor Series '94 with Jerry Lawler and his three little kings versus Doink the Clown and his three little doinks. And I think to this day on the podcast, that's the worst match we've watched so far. I would say go check it out. Don't.
It really,
Too late.
Yeah.
I've also seen the four doinks from the prior Survivor Series.
Yeah. I like that match better because at least it's funny. But oh man, just awful.
We've decided when we get to episode 50, we're gonna revisit some of those first couple episode matches, to see if I look at them differently. And I feel like I don't need to revisit that one. Like, we should revisit a couple bad matches.
No, I think you understood that one. I think you understood that one quite well at the time.
So, do we have some final thoughts before we wrap up today?
Man.
This kind of stuff is very dense. And if you're a wrestling fan that's never seen any of it, it can be tough to get into. But if you are a wrestling fan that is unsatisfied with everything that you see right now, but it's not that you don't want to get into wrestling, expand your horizons a little. Maybe check out 90s All Japan because a lot of people really, really love it. Or just check out other eras of Japanese wrestling or other foreign wrestling. If you've never seen British wrestling, check that out. If you've never watched Lucha Libre, check that out. There are so many different flavors of wrestling. So once again, if you're getting bored of wrestling,
Even modern day, current New Japan.
yeah, even modern day current New Japan is different than the products you'll see in America now. So if you're not tired of wrestling, but you're tired of all the wrestling you're seeing, check it out.
Dangerous backdrop. I just love, because we watch these matches with the original Japanese commentary, but the Japanese announcers use English words for the names of the moves, and it is unavoidably comical.
Every time somebody drops a high kick, it's great.
High kick, elbow. Masawa's
They count-
big move is the elbow,
they
and that's
count
what they
in
call
English.
it.
Backdrop
It's all about
driver.
elbows the whole time. And like when Kawada does that one backdrop, the announcer's like dangerous backdrop, and then he says dangerous like a few more times.
Gabe Sapolsky.
Or
used to
if
do that.
That is true.
something looks like it'll be to the end, like
Yes, crash and
they'll
burn.
say
dangerous.
like Misawa chance.
Yeah. I love it.
Dave, I really appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, thanks a lot, man.
Today.
So much for having me, you guys.
And I thank you for picking
thanks,
these
Dave.
matches. This is like a slice of wrestling history that I wouldn't have come across otherwise, and I feel like I learned a lot.
Thanks so much.
If you enjoyed today's episode or other episodes, you should check us out on Patreon, patreon.com/contestingwrestling. There, for $5 a month, you get access to bonus episodes, which we come out with at least one a week. We are hoping to eventually come out with more than one a week, but we'll see what's going on. And then if you don't want to go the full $5, you can still support us. Give us $1 a month, and you get access to the main feed episodes a couple weeks in advance. You should follow us on Twitter at ContestingW and tweet at us and let us know if there's anything you'd like to see us cover, if there's any corrections, any omissions, anything we missed, stuff like that, anything you think I should watch that will help me on my journey. And if you listen to us on any kind of a platform that allows you to like, comment, or subscribe or leave a positive review, please do those things because it really helps and we really appreciate it.
Dave, do you have anything you want to plug?
Well-
Anywhere people should follow you?
Let's see. For current day progressive, go to newjapanworld.com.
All right, cool.
Nice. Alrighty, this has been Contesting Wrestling. Thank you. We love you.